Hello, I am Meg Monday, one of the moderators on Cancer Connect. This web chat on brain fog and strategies to help get your thinking back on track is brought to you by the National Ovarian Cancer Coalition. In this informative web chat, neurocognitive expert Heather Palmer, Ph.D., discusses symptoms, causes, and solutions to cancer-related brain fog. Dr. Palmer is a Canadian clinician scientist with over 20 years of experience studying brain and behavior relationships. While Dr. Palmer works with many populations, she is particularly devoted to supporting cancer groups who are experiencing cancer-related brain fog. We want to thank Dr. Palmer and the National Ovarian Cancer Coalition for making today's web chat possible. I will now turn the presentation over to Dr. Palmer.
The topic of conversation today is talking a little bit about brain fog. So ultimately what we're trying to do is we really want to try and alleviate the feelings and the misunderstandings around the various symptoms that people will often experience as a result of some aspect of their cancer journey. So there's this strong tendency to just want to pull your hair out and feel like your brain is functioning a little bit out of control, or that things have changed for some reason. And there seems to be a lot of challenges around the terminology and the language to describe the experience. And there also seems to be a lack of validation sometimes from healthcare professionals that this particular condition, cancer-related brain fog, actually exists. So the objectives for today is to first and foremost acknowledge that cancer-related brain fog exists. So identify the symptoms and talk about some of the possible causes, but more importantly, let's look at some of the solutions. You know, what can we do, or what can you do to help improve the way you think, feel, and function so that you're able to function at the level that you were functioning at from a cognitive perspective prior to your cancer diagnosis. So the first thing really is to try and identify what is cancer-related brain fog. And more often than not, you'll probably hear people refer to this as chemo brain or chemo fog. And I have a slight aversion to the term chemo brain or chemo fog for two reasons. First and foremost, we know that chemotherapy is not the only cause. So historically speaking, what has happened is people have gone to their healthcare professionals for decades, and they've gone back and said, you know, I have this thing called chemo brain or chemo fog. And for whatever reason, healthcare professionals haven't been sure of the condition itself or what to necessarily do about it. And patients have felt that their condition hasn't actually been validated. And they typically refer to it as chemo brain or chemo fog, but we know from both science and research, and I'll show you some information in just a few minutes, that in fact it's not just chemotherapy that causes it. So if we continue to refer to this terminology as chemo brain or chemo fog, what you're doing is you're not validating the experience of everybody who has the same condition who never received chemotherapy or hasn't yet received it. So one reason that we call it cancer-related brain fog is to be a much more inclusive terminology to help to support and validate the condition that people who haven't had chemotherapy also have. Another reason is to recognize that cancer is not the only cause of brain fog. In fact, as we get older, we will experience brain fog just as a normal part of the aging process. There are many other diseases and conditions that can impact how our brain functions, causing brain fog, whether that's chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, Parkinson's disease. We also know most certainly that throughout our lives, we will have ups and downs and periods where our brain just doesn't seem to function as well, not only throughout our lives, but also throughout our days and our weeks. So we could experience stress-related brain fog. Or for those of you out there who have had a baby and you recall that extreme sleep-deprived brain fog. So there's many different causes of brain fog, and what we're talking about today really is cancer-related brain fog. So to summarize a definition, it's really a constellation of cognitive changes that come about as a result of some aspect of the cancer experience. And so what are those conditions, or what are those symptoms? What are most people experiencing as some of the changes? First and foremost, most people will describe memory as being their primary concern, but memory is a very big, broad term. And more often in the public domain, it's really a catchphrase for a whole bunch of different challenges that people experience in the area of memory. So if we were to drill it down a little bit further, typically speaking, when people talk about changes or challenges in their memory, they're most often referring to changes in verbal skills. So this might be challenges coming up with a name or a word that you want to come up with. Or others might notice changes and challenges in their difficulty with spelling. So out of the blue, having difficulty spelling a particular word, a simple word. And it might come to them several hours later, or it might just take a lot of effort, or it might not come to them at all. Other verbal skills changes, some people might notice that they have challenges putting their strings of thoughts together. So this might be in conversation, where all of a sudden they might lose their train of thought, or alternatively in writing. So let's say, for example, you're sending an email to a friend and you send it off to them and it comes back with question marks. And you get a chance to reread your email and you realize that some critical words or critical lines are missing from that email that you thought you typed in there, but in fact you didn't. So the whole gist of what you're trying to say doesn't really make sense. So these are some of the more verbal skills memory challenges that people will talk about. And a final one that people often express concern about is changes in their ability to read, or more specifically, remember what they've read. And that's really difficult. So for example, people might get to the end of an article, even if it's a short article, and they have trouble remembering the beginning of the article to put it all together. Or others often will describe, when they put their book down at night, when they pick it up the next night to start reading, they have to go back many, many pages to get the gist of what they've read the night before. And I'd like to finish off by talking about verbal skills challenges with respect to the reading experience, because it's really hard to know, are people not remembering what it was they've read? Or is it in fact an attention and concentration challenge? Because the bottom line from a pure memory perspective is, if you don't get the information into your brain in a way that's going to be sustainable and maintained, then it's unreasonable to expect yourself to remember it later. And for many people, as a result of some aspect of the cancer journey, from diagnosis right through survivorship, there can be significant changes in attention and concentration. So it's as if there's a barrier at some times of the day for us of information actually getting into our brain. And the amazing part is we are really incredible individuals at faking attention. We can smile and nod our heads and feel like we're paying attention, when in fact our mind might be thinking about something else, or just taking a rest and have a complete blank. So there's the appearances of paying attention and processing the information, but the information isn't actually going in at all. And there are some very common barriers to general attention and concentration, and many of these barriers are felt and experienced on a fairly regular basis by people who are in the midst of a cancer journey. One is fatigue. So without question, we cannot possibly attend and pay attention and process information nearly as well when we're tired as when we're not tired. Another one is pain. Our brain's ability to process information when we're in pain is compromised because part of our brain is focusing its attention on that pain. And then finally, stress or anxiety. So without question, when we're stressed or anxious about something, our brain's ability to actually process and pull the information into a way that we'll remember it later can be compromised. So oftentimes when people are having challenges with their memory or verbal skills aspects of memory particularly, it may in fact be related to quite significant changes in the ability to pay attention and concentrate, which then has a domino effect, because if we're not able to pay attention and pull the information in and process it in a way that's meaningful to us, then the likelihood of remembering it later is pretty slim. An analogy I often like to give to people is, imagine going to put $20 in your pocket and you just slip. You miss your back pocket, but you don't realize it. That's similar to what the experience can often be. There's that sensation and the feeling that you've put the $20 there, but when you go to look for it later, it's just not there because it never actually got in there in the first place. And this hopefully that analogy helps to explain some of the challenges that some people face when we talk about memory, attention, and concentration. A bigger area of change that a lot of people will also describe is in what we call the area of executive functions, or our higher level thinking skills. So these are all the thinking skills that differentiate us from other animals. So the ability to make decisions, and the ability to plan strategically, and the ability to organize. So, and all of these particular functions, lots of people who have been diagnosed and treated for cancer will say that this is where they seem to have the greatest challenges. You know, they might find themselves taking a long time to make simple decisions, even in a grocery store, trying to decide which toilet paper brand to buy. Others might discuss, you know, that their ability to really plan and organize and think ahead becomes a little bit more compromised. So there's more a sense of flying by the seat of their pants, or constantly feeling like they're running behind or running late for things. Another big area of the executive functions that we like to talk about is what we call multitasking. So many people will describe changes in their feeling or their ability to get multiple things done across a certain time period or a complete day. So typically speaking, a lot of us will operate our day by having multiple balls in the air at one time. So you might start the laundry, and we don't actually typically sit in front of the washing machine and watch it for 40 minutes, rather instead go off and do something, and then at around 45 minutes or so, we might come down and change over the laundry. And this is how we are able to successfully get through our days, through repeatedly multitasking and doing one thing after another. And this seems to have become compromised for many people who have been treated and diagnosed and treated for cancer. And a big part of that probably has to do with what we call the mental pop-up. And if you actually think about it, the brain is really quite remarkable, because a big successful way that we get through our day-to-day lives is information just happens to pop into mind out of the blue. So out of the blue, you're reminded that you have to pick up your children, or turn on the oven, or call the pharmacy, or take the dog for a walk, or change over the laundry. And what happens for a lot of people who have been diagnosed and treated for cancer is that their mental pop-up seems to become suppressed in some way. Either information doesn't pop into mind when it's supposed to, or it doesn't pop in at all, or it pops in way too early or way too late. And this is what's having a significant impact on lots of people's ability to multitask, because we've become very dependent on our information, our brain just popping information into mind when we actually need it to. So the executive functions are certainly probably one of the biggest areas of change that people will comment on as it having an impact on their day-to-day life, especially from the perspective of returning to whatever it was they were doing prior to their diagnosis, whether that was being a student, being a mom, being a professional, being a wife, a child, etc. One other area that I do like to talk a little bit about, because a lot of people don't think of this as being a cognitive change, and they don't necessarily recognize it right off the bat. But as soon as we start talking about it, people say, wow, I do that too. So research has shown us that oftentimes people treated, diagnosed and treated for cancer will have subtle changes in spatial skills. So spatial skills is the concept of where your body is relative to the space around you. So as you move around through your environment, you're less likely to bump into things because you have a concept of where those objects are relative to your body. And a lot of people have noticed since cancer that they have some challenges, and they're more likely to actually bump into things. So they have these unidentified bruises on their legs and their arms from where they've bumped into a coffee table, or they've gone through a doorway and they've accidentally bumped into the edge of the door. And the challenge is not only can sometimes cancer impact your spatial skills, your concept of space around you, but it can also impact ever so subtly your motor function and coordination. So let's say you are about to walk through a doorway, and you're about to hit the edge of the doorway because your spatial skills are a little off, but you caught yourself. But because of subtle changes in motor function and coordination, you might overcompensate and end up hitting the other side and jamming your other shoulder into the other side of the doorway. Or others will notice the subtle changes in this combination of factors when they put something on a table. So they might be noticing that they're starting to drop things a lot more. So they go to put a cup on the edge of a table, they've misjudged that space ever so slightly, so it's now teetering off the edge, and then their ability to bend down and quickly catch it from falling and crashing to the ground has also become subtly compromised. So it's almost a sensation of butterfingers, if you will. So ultimately, people are starting to describe symptoms of feeling a lot more like Mr. Bumpy and Mr. Clumsy, if you remember that book series from when you were younger. One other area I'll caution you to think through about spatial skills and motor function and coordination is with respect to driving. So we do have lots of people who will comment and suggest that they've noticed subtle changes in their ability to, whether it's park the car, so they find themselves parking much further away from the curb than they used to, or feeling a little bit more challenged when they're trying to fit into a tight spot. And others will make comments that they're noticing changes when they're making turns. So a right-handed turn, they might be cutting the corner a little bit more tightly than they used to and going up over the edge. Or a left-handed turn, they might be going a little bit too wide into the center of the intersection. So these could be attributed to some subtle changes in the spatial skills and the concept of the space around. So we talked about a little bit about some of the symptoms, and those are the most common symptoms. So when cancer survivors are studied, those are the symptoms and the concerns that are identified most often. But people often want to know, what's caused cancer-related brain fog. And obviously, the first finger-pointing exercise was chemotherapy. This is why, in fact, people typically call it chemo brain or chemo fog. And it's a pretty smart place to start because we know that chemotherapy can be pretty strong, and there's a whole bunch of side effects that can go with different combinations of chemotherapy cocktails. And some of the earlier research trying to understand cancer-related brain fog most certainly focused heavily on the role that chemotherapy might be playing. And some of the best research that we're finding in terms of identifying the role of chemotherapy is coming from animal literature, where there's a little bit more freedom and flexibility to modify the cocktails and the combinations of drugs that are being given. And they do find, in fact, in both humans, mostly in breast cancer survivors, where a lot of the research has been done, and in the animal literature, that high doses of chemotherapy and certain combinations of chemotherapy seem to be putting people in a greater risk category for having cancer-related brain fog. However, I can tell you, since starting running cancer-related brain fog programs in 2007, and we've seen over 3,000 to 4,000 cancer survivors go through our programs, lots of people, there are tons of people in those programs who have never had chemotherapy, or their chemotherapy hasn't started. And so we need to understand what is causing their symptoms, because the symptoms and the challenges they're facing are the very exact same ones that I just described. So chemotherapy cannot possibly be the only cause of cancer-related brain fog. So another area of research that's being explored right now is perhaps there's something about our autoimmune system's response to the cancer. So when our body detects cancer, it detects it long before we do. And there are all kinds of changes that occur as a result of that. So any foreign object or any disease or illness or bacteria or virus, the body will detect and it will start to launch an attack on that. And as a result of that, there can be an increase in the release of the production of what are called cytokines. And we do know that cytokines can pass the blood-brain barrier and they can cause some inflammation of the brain. So one line of research that's currently being explored is it possible that our own body's attempt to fight the cancer could be contributing to some of the cognitive challenges that some people are facing? Another area of research to explore what else might be causing cancer-related brain fog would be medication, because it's not common that people who are being treated for cancer, are they only being treated with chemotherapy? There tends to be a whole host of other medications, both prescribed and initiated by the individual themselves, that are changes in terms of what they're actually ingesting and what their body is now being required to metabolize. So for some, it might be anti-nausea pills or steroids or anti-anxiety or some sleep medication or an increase in pain medication. Others might be looking at more homeopathic and naturopathic remedies, and they might be taking other pills Or they might be changing their food intake and their nutrients, increasing the number of antioxidants, drinking green teas, eating more blueberries, switching from rice to quinoas. So there's a reason to believe that over and above just chemotherapy, there are lots of other ingestible changes that our body is trying to metabolize. And we don't yet know what the combination of all of these other drugs, both prescribed and non-prescribed, may have as an impact on our body and, more importantly, on our brain. So it is possible that research will eventually determine that there are certain combinations that might be exacerbating a cancer-related brain fog condition. And then finally, we'd be remiss if we didn't consider genetics, because oftentimes people will say that they'll sit in a support group and sitting right beside them is somebody else who's similar age, similar background, same cancer, same treatment, even with the same doctors in the same hospitals. And yet there seems to be quite a difference between the two people in terms of their physical or their cognitive function. So it's hard to explain why some people may have cognitive challenges and others might not. And one explanation and one line of research is to suggest maybe there's something in our genetic makeup. Perhaps some of us are just genetically predisposed that when you put a certain combination of factors together, they are going to tip the balance. And for one person, that might cause some cognitive challenges. And for somebody else, it might cause physical challenges. And it's not an unreasonable line of thinking. If you think about it, oftentimes when there's a flu bug or some sort of bug going around, whether it's within your community or within your household, the way it manifests itself can differ. There'll be some commonalities, certainly, but there can also be a lot of differences within the family, even though everybody has the same bug. So some might get nauseous, some might get a headache, some might get tummy cramps. So there might be something about our genetic composition that contributes to how our body responds to illness, whatever it might be. And that might be impacting why some people might be similar in all components, and yet one of them has more significant cognitive challenges than the other. And most certainly, some of this line of research is looking at conditions that might be better known for having cognitive components. So in particular, one research project was looking at the gene mutation that can be associated with a familial form of Alzheimer's disease, which is a very, very small percentage of the population. But when they did a longitudinal study on people who had that gene mutation, they did find for people who had that gene mutation, when and if they went on to develop cancer, they seemed to have a greater challenge with their cognitive capacity than those who did not. So there is some evidence to suggest that perhaps our genetic makeup is contributing to why some people have cancer-related brain fog versus others who do not. And then, of course, the final area of research and possible cause is our psychological constructs, our feelings about ourselves and our psychological well-being, such as happiness and optimism and feelings of control and independence. We know for certain that how we feel about ourselves has a huge impact on how well we function, both cognitively and physically. So if cancer is impacting our psychological well-being, then it stands to suggest that that might also have an impact on our cognitive well-being. So what do we know? Well, first and foremost, we know that cancer-related brain fog exists, and it doesn't just exist for those who have chemotherapy. We know that there's a variety of different causes, and that while research is searching for those causes, there's no reason for us not to come up with solutions in the meantime. We do know from certain studies that people who experience cancer-related brain fog typically will start talking about their concerns following their treatments, although the condition itself will often present itself during treatment. And the reason more often people will talk about it following their treatments is, typically speaking, during the treatment time, because of the many physical side effects that come and inconveniences that can come with treatment, the focus of attention seems to be more heavily weighted on that. And it seems to be more so that when people are told that things are getting back to normal and they're working towards re-entering the workforce or their roles in their family lives, etc., that they're noticing that the cognitive piece is lingering a little bit. Research has also suggested that as many as 80% of all people diagnosed with cancer will experience some form of cancer-related brain fog, and that the condition can vary for how long it lasts. A lot of people often ask, well, how long will this last? And while it does vary, the research is suggesting that it continues to get better over time for most people, but that time period can take up to a year or two, and then there'll be a much smaller set of the population who may continue to have some challenges beyond that time period. And really at that point, that's where you a lot will determine how long this condition might last for you based on what you're doing to address it, and based on other factors such as stress and anxiety, financial burdens, your capacity for getting back to the things that are meaningful, important to you as well. So let's talk a little bit about some of the solutions. So before we talk about the solutions, I'd like to share this slide because it's a great indication of several factors. First and foremost, that sometimes our tests aren't always picking up what's going on in people's brains. But secondly, it also helps to explain some of the extreme fatigue that cancer survivors will often face. So this is what's called a functional magnetic resonance image study. So there was only 2 participants in this study. One had had cancer and was treated for it, and the other did not. The beauty of this study is that they were identical twins. So for all intents and purposes, their genetic makeup was the exact same, except one had had cancer and was treated for it, and the other had not. The one who had had cancer expressed on a regular basis to her healthcare professional that she just didn't think she was thinking as well as she used to, that she felt she had this condition she referred to as chemo brain or chemo fog. And so twin A and twin B went through a whole battery of neuropsychological tests, examining all the functions we've talked about: memory, language, strategy, decision-making, multitasking, etc. And there were no significant differences between twin A and twin B on those tests. Then they had an opportunity to go into what's called a functional magnetic resonance image machine. So this is an MRI with a functional component, which means that when the person is in the scanner, they're actually doing a task, an exercise of sorts. And while they're doing that task, the researchers can look to see where does the blood go to throughout the brain as they're doing this task. So if you will, it's a window of opportunity to look inside a working brain and see how it's functioning. And in this particular task, it was a working memory task. So twin A was in the scanner doing the working memory task, and then twin B. And working memory is an in and out process where we're constantly trying to take new information in, hold it in mind for a few minutes, and then spit it out. And the results that you have in front of you are the 3 different phases of the working memory test. So twin A is horizontal across the top, and twin B is horizontal across the bottom. Twin A is the one who had cancer and was treated for it. And then if you look vertically, the test gets more and more difficult. So when they're in the scanner, it's quite likely to expect to see changes in the brain function as the test gets more difficult. The brain is probably having to work a little bit harder. Now, what's really interesting about this study is the significant difference between twin A and twin B in the simplest form of the test. So the color that you see is where the blood is going to in the brain. And for twin A, even at the simplest form of the test, and no matter how difficult it got, she was really activating her brain. She was really having to work hard to do the task just as well as her counterpart. Twin B, on the other hand, in the simple form of the task, there's very little color that you see in the brain. So what that means is that there's not a lot of blood flow going to those areas of the brain. So she's functioning and doing the task quite well without a whole lot of effort. But as the task gets more difficult, more and more blood flow is going to the brain. So she's working a little bit harder. And I think this is a really important finding for 2 reasons. First, twin A did just as well as twin B did on the task. But when we look at inside the brain, we can see that the effort to do just as well was much stronger and much greater. And I think it's really important for cancer survivors to understand that we can still function as well as we used to, but it might take a lot more effort and a little bit more time. And as a result of that, there might be some sacrifices. So this could help to explain some of the extreme fatigue that people feel, even on a day where they haven't got a whole lot going on. Because if our brains are having to work that much extra hard than our brain used to perform simple daily activities, it's not surprising that there would be both brain fatigue and physical fatigue at the end of a day. And one area of particular concern for me, especially when people are returning to work, is the cumulative effect of this. So day one at work, you might feel all right and have lots of energy, but your brain is working a little bit harder. So by day two, you might be getting a little bit more tired. Day three, perhaps starting to make mistakes. Day four, really just looking forward to Friday coming and the work week being over. And then people often in a return to work situation find themselves sleeping excessively on the weekends, if that's their work week, to make up their energy to be able to get back to work on Monday. And that's when it becomes a quality of life issue. So what are the solutions? Well, we know that brain fog exists and we want to do our best to understand it and prevent it. But in order to treat it, there are no pharmacological interventions at this point in time that can help. Some doctors may prescribe some medications that can help with other conditions, like medications for attention deficit disorder, or medications for anxiety and depression, or medications for sleep. And as a result of those successful remedies, people might find some improvements in their cognitive capacity. But there is no known medication that reliably helps people with cancer-related brain fog. So that really just leaves us with cognitive rehabilitation, which is really what the focus of the remainder of the talk will be. And in order to talk about neurocognitive rehabilitation, I do want to talk a little wee bit about the brain, because I want everybody to start thinking of their brain in a slightly different way. And most people have heard the term neuroplasticity. So neuroplasticity is this concept that the brain has the capacity to build new connections between brain regions, and that we can compensate for areas that have changed for whatever reason. So historically speaking, most people felt that the brain was fairly static beyond our developing years. So what that meant was most people felt that as we got older, our brain just started to deteriorate over time, with brain cells dying, with atrophy or shrinkage, etc. And that's why people started to function less well in their aging years. But in the last several decades, it's become that much more apparent and obvious that our brain actually does have the capacity to continue to develop pathways between brain regions. We can build new brain cells, and we can, in fact, mold our brain and improve our brain functioning. And we've seen this time and time again across a variety of different diseases and brain injuries, where the brain has redeveloped around an area that's been damaged for whatever reason, or has compensated for a disease process in one way. So rather than thinking of your brain as having a whole bunch of bits and pieces that help you to function, what I really want you to think about for the remainder of this talk and moving forward is, imagine your brain as having a whole series of superhighways where information is going back and forth at rapid speed. And this is how you function. How the front part of your brain speaks to you, the back part of your brain or the side of your brain, is because of these highway systems that you've built up over time. And for some reason, something about the cancer or the treatment has caused there to be potholes and cracks in those highway systems, or some of those highway systems seem to be beyond repair and have completely been destroyed somehow, some way. And our goal, in order to really regain our cognitive function, is to fill in the cracks and potholes, or to build new pathways. And that's what we're going to talk about for the remainder of this session. So when we talk about neuroplasticity and cognitive rehabilitation, there's three main areas that we focus on. The first one is, how can we repair existing pathways? So if you're imagining your brain as having a whole series of pathways and highways, and these highways have cracks and potholes, the best news for me is when somebody says to me, Heather, I used to do that, but I don't do that anymore. Because that tells me that they have the pathway, they have the foundation of the pathway there, but for some reason it's just not functioning. So we need to help smooth out that surface. So the way you can repair existing pathways inside your brain is simply by using techniques and strategies that you already have and that have worked for you in the past. Start digging them up. Why do we sometimes use certain strategies in work but not at home, or at home but not at work? Or why do we say, yes, I used to do that when I was busier? Start thinking through your cognitive toolbox and what strategies have worked for you in the past, and practice them and use them as often as possible, even when not necessary. So for example, if you're at the bank and the teller happens to have their name tag on, even though you don't need to know their name or learn their name, while they go to get your money or do the transaction for you, come up with a way to remember their name. Their name is Sally, and you think, oh, you know what? She reminds me of my niece, Sally. Take that extra little bit of effort to use a strategy, because every time you use a strategy, whether you need it or not, in essence, what you're doing is you're throwing another layer of pavement on that pathway. And the more and more you do that, you're filling in these cracks and potholes. So what you're doing is you're helping to build up and strengthen and smooth out a pathway that you will need for something else that's more important later on. Secondly, we do have the capacity to build new pathways. As I mentioned, research has shown us, especially for people who've had stroke or significant brain injuries, that sometimes if they're not able to repair the existing pathways, they're able to learn new ways to do something and actually build a new pathway around the brain region that's been compromised for whatever reason. So the way you build, now building a new pathway absolutely takes much more time, much more effort, but it is possible. So building new pathways, for those of you who might be having cognitive challenges and you can't think of anything in your toolbox or existing pathways, that would be learning something new. So learning new strategies, seeking support from peers and colleagues and support groups. You know, what do you do? How do you handle this situation? And then you practice and practice and practice their strategy, so that every single time you're practicing and working on it, you're actually building a new pathway within your brain. And then the third area that I really want people to think a lot about, because it's grossly undervalued as being as important as it is, and that is the recognition that just like our highway systems, our brain can experience rush hour. So you need to take the time to really explore over the course of your day, what are your alert times and what are your fatigue times? Because we all have them. And they might have shifted as a result of some aspect of your cancer diagnosis or treatment or survivorship. So identifying your alert times and putting your planned activities that really require your brain to be during those alert times, and using your fatigue times for the tasks that don't require a whole lot of cognitive resources, is the best way to start planning your days. And that might have changed. You may have previously been a morning person and bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and now you realize that you're really groggy and it takes a long time to get going in the morning. So that means that you need to not have your meetings with accountants and important cognitive functions first thing in the morning. You want to shift those to the afternoon when you've identified your alert time. And a lot of people will ask me repeatedly, you know, Heather, how come I could do this in the morning and I can't do it in the afternoon? And I really want you to recognize that it's very similar to rush hour. We can plan our days around when our brain's going to work our best for us, and we can plan our days around when our brain's not going to work the best for us. Just like for those of you who live in big cities where there's traffic and rush hour, you would never expect to get from point A to point B during rush hour in the same amount of time as in non-rush hour. So start to think of your life that way and plan around when you're most cognitively alert for your most cognitively demanding tasks to get the best function out of yourself. I'm going to describe a three-pronged program that we use to help support people to maximize their thinking capacity. So we call it a multidimensional program. And this program, the underlying foundation of the program is in fact the neuroplasticity concepts I just described to you. So each component of these programs are designed to help people to repair existing pathways, build new pathways, and most certainly create an acute sense of awareness of when they're at the top of their game and when they should be using cognitive resources versus the times of the day when they might not be quite so cognitively strong. And this three-pronged process or three-pronged program, multidimensional program, focuses on memory, task management, and psychological well-being. So I'll give you a little bit of insight into each of these three quite quickly, and then hopefully we'll have some time for some questions. So from a memory perspective, ultimately, while most people say that it's memory that is their biggest challenge, in fact, we find that it's not about the capacity and the amount of information they're remembering. More, it's about how they're processing the information. So there tends to be a change, as I alluded to earlier, with attention and concentration, and other changes with our ability to actually pull the information into our brain in a deep and meaningful way so it's actually usable later. More, what often seems to be the case now is people tend to find that information is just sort of fluttering on the surface of the brain. And as soon as there's any kind of distraction or interference, it slips away. It's like, boom, it's gone. And what's interesting about levels of processing is it can take very simple, tiny little subtle changes that can really help you to improve the way you process information. So this is a very old study that was done with university students who were given all three groups. There was three groups of university students, and they were each given a memory test, and each of them was given a slightly different instruction for how to do the memory test. The first group was told they were going to be given a list of words and they needed to remember them, but to focus on the first letter of each word. So if the word were ball, you might think B. The second group was given the same list of words and the same instruction, except they were told, when you focus on the word, I want you to come up with a rhyme for the word. So if the word is ball, you might think hall. And the third group was told, okay, when I say the words to you, I want you to use them in a sentence. So if the word were ball, they might think, my son likes to play with a ball. And what you have in front of you are the results. So 40 minutes later, when their memory was tested, it was found that the university students who focused on the first letter, which is very surface processing, really remembered less than 20%, 18% in fact. Whereas the group who focused on the word in a sentence, so in order to use a word in a sentence, you have to think more deeply about the word. You have to think about what the word means. You have to put it in the sentence using grammatical rules, such as having a verb and a subject in it. And quite often, when people use sentences, they will use a sentence that has some sort of meaning to them. So my son likes to play with a ball is very true. So the simple, subtle process of thinking a little bit more deeply about the information resulted in just a 40-minute delay, a significantly improved ability to remember. So as you think forward to improving your thinking capacity and how can you process information more deeply, you don't need to focus on newfangled technology and you don't need to go to extreme measures. Sometimes it could be something as subtle as creating an association or coming up with a story or creating a visual image around the information. Or another internal strategy, one of my favorites, is motor movement. So engaging in some sort of movement that's a motor way. So for example, if I was going to go to the movies and later that night I wanted to remember to take my glasses, I might use a motion with my hands to imitate putting glasses on my face. That simple, subtle movement is likely going to increase my ability to remember later on when somebody says, honey, let's go to the movies. I will have this deep-rooted recollection and mental pop-up of, oh, just a minute, let me go get my glasses. So processing information, trying to find ways to process information in subtle ways that is deeper than what your surface level thinking is going to contribute to an improvement in memory. And as the slide says in front of you, quite often people will focus on both internal and external strategies. I'm a big fan of external strategies. And for those young people in the audience today, external strategies tend to be there tends to be a greater resistance to using external strategies for young people for some reason. I think that's because young brains are very successful at having information just pop into mind when they need to. And people typically think of external strategies as being an older person's approach or a very busy person's approach. But I can tell you, especially given that I'm an aging expert first and foremost, that as we get older, we need to start to rely more heavily on external strategies such as lists and notes and calendars and timers. Because our brain, as it gets older or as it experiences changes for whatever reason, such as cancer, just doesn't have the ability to successfully keep as much information in our head. So we need to rely a little bit more heavily on the external strategies. So for example, external self-talk is one of my favorites. So it's the process of talking out loud. Something as simple as saying, I'm going upstairs to get my glasses, is a clear external verbalization. And the process of saying that and doing that increases the likelihood when you get upstairs that you will actually remember your glasses. And the reason it's so successful is there's 3 factors at play. Firstly, we can't speak as fast as we can think. So when we actually talk out loud to ourselves, we're forcing ourselves to go at a processing speed that's a little bit more consistent with what our brain can handle. Secondly, when we think inside our head, there's a great tendency to be able to jump all over the place from thought to thought. But when you actually talk out loud, you're more likely to speak in an organized fashion. So what happens by talking out loud, you go a little bit slower and you organize your thoughts a little bit better. So that simple, subtle approach improves your brain's ability to process the information, which then increases the likelihood of remembering it when you get upstairs or at some point in the future. And the third factor that helps with external self-talk, especially if it's just a short duration, is you might even have that sense of ringing in your ears. You get upstairs and you think, what did I come up here for? And you can almost hear yourself saying, oh yes, I'm coming up to get my glasses. So that's considered an external strategy. Another external strategy on this slide that I just want to really quickly point out is the use of timers. So lists and notes and calendars, I'm sure everybody will say they know what that they do and they do that well, but I implore you, I encourage you to really, really examine your lists and your calendars, and are they truly effective for you, and are you using them as effectively as you could? Timers I like to talk about because they're a great example of a technique or a strategy that you might use in one situation and yet not think about using it in another situation. So there are not many people who will cook a soft-boiled egg or bake cookies without turning on the timer in the kitchen. So there's almost an instinctive recognition that using the external strategy of a timer is going to help to prompt you to remember something. So recognizing that, if you're one of those people who has difficulties with time or remembering things at particular periods of time, whether it's medications, then why not set timers to go off? Why not, if you're the person who sits down at nighttime to do just a little bit of emailing and you find it's 2 in the morning and you're still Googling goodness knows what, why not when you sit down, if time is an issue, sit down, take a proactive measure and say, you know what, I'm going to do emailing for about 30 minutes, set the timer for 30 minutes. And then when the timer goes off, that's your prompt. That's what's pulling you back to a present-minded state, to prompt yourself to say, you know what, I've got to go to bed, or you know what, I'm just going to finish this off. Just in the way that we use timers to help guide us in a kitchen, we can use timers to help guide us throughout the rest of our day. And ultimately, the key with memory strategies and techniques is to explore what's in your cognitive toolbox. What are all of the strategies that you've used up until now that really help to support you? And what are some new strategies that you can learn from friends and colleagues and people in various support groups that you might go to? Because there's a very good likelihood that many people around you are experiencing some of the same cognitive challenges, and perhaps they've come up with solutions that work well for them that will also work for you. If we talk about task management is all about helping people to manage their small and large daily tasks in a way that they're a little bit more present-minded as opposed to absent-minded. Because what we do here often is we hear people say that they have a great difficulty with being distracted or interference. They go to do something, something catches their eye, and then all of a sudden they're lost or confused. And as a result, they have all kinds of things started and a bunch of things that they never finish throughout the day. And oftentimes, people also say that they find that the complexities of day-to-day life seem much more overwhelming than they used to. So task management is a 4-step process that I'll go through with you that's designed to help reduce all of these feelings of overwhelm by simplifying life, manage both small and large daily tasks in very much the same way by using the same steps. And what the steps do is they're really promoting that present-minded. So you're always consciously aware of what you're doing and why you're doing it, rather than operating in an absent-minded state. Because when we're absent-minded, we don't actually process the information very well, and therefore we don't remember it. And so the 4 steps also can help prevent you from getting distracted in the first place. Or beautifully, if you do get distracted, as long as you're churning through these 4 steps on a regular basis, you will catch yourself and you'll pull your mind back to the present. So let me show you how it works. The 4 steps are stop, clarify, simplify, and monitor. So they're very simple. The first stopping mechanism is where you need to jolt yourself back and just stop regularly throughout the day. So somebody who successfully uses these 4 steps would be churning through them hundreds of times a day. So people might think it sounds exhausting, but it really takes less than a second. And what you want to do is you want to take advantage of any kind of transition. So any movement, if you go from sitting to standing, or from watching TV to reading a book, or from the living room to the dining room. So anytime there's a natural transition, that's a natural opportunity to just quickly stop for a minute, take a deep breath, and clear your mind. And once you've done that, you then move into the next step, which is clarify. So in clarify, you would ask yourself 1 or 2, maybe 3 simple questions such as, where was I going? Or what was I doing? Or what was the priority here? And then as you move from there, depending on the answer to your question, it gives you the opportunity to simplify and to break things down into a series of simple, manageable steps. So what you've done through stop, clarify, and simplify is you've taken the moment of a transition to just pull yourself back, because you might be moving from A to B or doing something without thinking about it. It's an opportunity to just quickly stop, pull your mind to a present state where you're consciously aware of what you're doing. You're consciously asking yourself, what's next, or what's the priority, or what do I need to do here? And then you're answering the question in a calm way by listing out a series of simple steps so that you can then act and be successful. And then the monitor is the feedback loop. We need to constantly monitor where we are and stop and clarify throughout our day. So when I use stop and clarify, I mean, as soon as I get in the car, I will stop and clarify and say, where am I going? What time is it? How much time do I have to get there? As I'm driving the car, I will stop and clarify to keep myself mindful of where I'm going and what I'm doing, because I might be taking a route that's different to normal or going in a different location. And sometimes when our mind goes into that absent-minded place, it might go onto autopilot and we might take an exit that we didn't intend to take. And then all of a sudden we're confused and perplexed about where we are and what we're doing. So stop and clarify can really help with both large and small daily tasks. And I strongly encourage you, as a bare minimum, to try and use stop and clarify, immediately following this session, and just see what it does for you from the perspective of present-mindedness. Because when you're present-minded, you're more likely to then process the information in a better way, and you're much more able to remember the information later on. And then the very final component of the multidimensional program is psychological well-being, which really refers to how we feel about ourselves and others, constructs such as happiness, optimism, feelings of control. And we know from science and research that when people feel good about themselves, when their levels of optimism and happiness and feelings of control are high, then their cognitive scores are high. So if they were tested on memory, language, multitasking, those will be high scores. When people are tested again, if for whatever reason their psychological well-being scores are lower, so they're not so happy, not so feeling in control, and not so optimistic, then their cognitive scores will also go down. So what we know is that there's a strong correlation that how we feel about ourselves is directly related to how well we think. What we don't know is what causes what. So if I'm feeling great, is that why I think well, or do I think well because I'm feeling great? So to truly maximize your cognitive capacity, it's really important that you get yourself into a positive spiraling self-fulfilling prophecy. So a positive feeling of where I feel I'm in control, and because I feel I'm in control, I'm capable. And because of that, I feel independent, and I'm solutions oriented, and I'm optimistic, and I feel clear in my head. More often than not, what can happen is people can get themselves into a negative spiraling cycle where for whatever reason, they feel like they've lost control. Something about the cancer has caused them to lose control over some aspects, or they might feel all aspects of their life. And that might make them feel as though they're incompetent, and they start to reduce activities, and they start to avoid challenges and socializing less. And that has an impact on quality of life, which then can lead to pessimism and feelings of depression and anxiety. And it can become a negative spiraling cycle because we know that when people aren't feeling good about themselves, they're not going to think as well. And when they're not thinking as well, they feel like they've lost control. So it becomes this negative spiraling cycle. So ultimately, to truly improve your cognitive capacity, you want to work on your psychological well-being, engage in activities that are purposeful and meaningful, find control over the areas of your life that you have control over, and celebrate those. So just to very quickly summarize, there's no question that cancer-related brain fog exists. It is a real condition. There are many healthcare practitioners who are still learning about it, and the research is certainly up in the air about it. But the challenges with the research happens to be more so in our ability to actually test the condition rather than the existence of the condition. The symptoms will absolutely vary from person to person. So just as we are all individuals and the cancer will affect us in different ways and the treatments will affect us in different ways, most certainly cancer-related brain fog will affect us differently. However, there are common domains that are affected, and those most common domains are areas of memory, in particular verbal skills challenges, coming up with words, and executive functions. So higher level thinking skills like planning and organizing and multitasking and decision making. We know that chemotherapy is not the only cause, and there is currently no medications that are designed to treat it or prevent it, but the brain does have the capacity to grow. So we know through neuroplasticity that we can develop new connections, and we can help repair existing connections to compensate for areas of damage, and that neurocognitive rehabilitation programs where you focus on memory and external strategy use, you focus on task management and stop and clarify, and you focus on your psychological well-being, we know that those can have a positive impact. And ultimately, what these programs are designed to do is to help fast track some of the cognitive changes that you're experiencing to get you back to functioning just as well as you did cognitively at a much faster rate than otherwise you would have on your own. So how can loved ones help someone experiencing this? I think that's an absolutely fantastic question. And I think one of the challenges for many people and many families is there seems to be an expectation that when the outward signs and symptoms of cancer and treatment are gone, so when hair starts to grow back in, when energy is starting to come back, when doctors are saying that things are much better, there is the expectation from family and friends and ourselves, in fact, that our thinking capacity is completely back. But what people are often finding is that our ability to fully function from a brain's perspective lags a little bit further behind some of those physical symptoms. And as a result, it's very hard for family members to understand this, or coworkers or bosses because it's hard for us to understand it. So I think the first way to get families to help is to have them understand and recognize that while physically there might be signs and indications that everything is returning back to normal, cognitively there might be some sort of delays. And as a result, you really need the family and friends to support you in terms of using some of these external strategies and to be patient and to help you to build those pathways up again. I'm just looking at some of the pre-submitted questions. And most of them did fall within the presentation I gave. One question was, does exhaustion fall under the brain fog category? And I do want to address that in particular because absolutely, exhaustion, our ability to think clearly when we're tired is compromised. So our ability to process the information and really get it into our brain when there's either fatigue, as I mentioned, or pain, or significant stress and worry, it's as if it just keeps hitting the forehead and not going anywhere. And yet we feel as though we're paying attention, or we might be trying very hard to concentrate and pay attention, but the information is just not getting in there in a place that it's actually going to stick. And as a result, it could be a day later, several hours later, when somebody says, remember I told you that? And you may have no recollection of the conversation whatsoever, even though you appeared to be engaged in the conversation at the time. So absolutely, pain, fatigue, and worry will have an impact on your ability to get the information in, which is then going to have a domino effect on your ability to get the information out again. So most certainly you want to strategically plan your day and your activities around when there's less pain, when there's less worry, and when there's less fatigue. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for participating. Good luck and think well.